So our next session on this room 3 is about Metaverse and the employee experience. And the speaker is Richard Harbridge. So interesting topic to close up this room.
Very excited to share about it. It's a hard topic to cover in a short amount of time, and the biggest challenge with these types of sessions is there's so much we want to share, and to be prescriptive where you are in your journey is really difficult. So there's been other speakers at the conference too that are really friendly. I've known them for years. I really encourage people, if you haven't had a chance yet, to reach out on LinkedIn and message some of those speakers, maybe even message some fellow attendees, and start the conversation as we move forward. Because while it's great to hear people speak, often the one-to-one discussions that follow are really, really valuable. So with that, I'll just kick it off here. So today's discussion is really about three things from my perspective. One is, how real is some of this stuff? So I'm going to try and look at it pragmatically. And you may find that while spoiler alert, while I'm going to say we want to move forward faster and exploration and things like that are necessary and should be encouraged, at the end of the day, some of these capabilities just aren't there yet, or they're not necessarily safe at scale to use from an enterprise perspective. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And at the same time, sort of the second point I want to make is, how does this connect to employee experience patterns? So when we think of the employee experience, we think of culture, we think of the physical environment, we think of the environment around digital technologies and technological progress. And so I want to reference how it kind of correlates to those things, or at least some ways to think about it, to kind of introduce you to those concepts, which will help with discussions with executives and leaders, because of course employee experience is top of mind. And then the last thing that I'd love to do is just give you a little bit of insight on things. I'm sure many of you have been to multiple sessions at the Metaverse event. They're very informative, but I figured I'd do a high level in case this is new to you, or in case you want to share this material, the slides or other things with other stakeholders. So with that, I'll dive right in. My name is Richard Harbridge. I'm a Microsoft MVP of many years. I'm a Chief Technology Officer at a company called Tutalead, and we've done a lot of projects within this sort of category. Of course, employee experience has been something that we've been part of for a long time, but we've done HoloLens 2 projects, real-world implementations with customers. We've done, various immersive experiences and things like that, and we've actually done SharePoint Spaces projects and a bunch of other things. So I wanted to kind of pull some of the insights we've learned through that and talk about it. So again, everything is real, right? There's ways to use these tools in our organizations today, and I hope to share insight. Last comment, again, I mentioned it just before we started, but super friendly people, speakers, attendees, most people, especially in this Metaverse space, we're all learning together. So feel free to reach out for one-on-one discussions or follow-ups. So what are we hearing from an industry perspective? Well, the most obvious thing we can start with is that the employee experience is a top priority for most executives and leaders, for sure. In 2023 and 2022, this is going to continue. It's a big emphasis point. And the challenge we have today is there's a bunch of challenges in employee experience, but specifically most people cite issues on collaboration and ineffective, or, we could improve communication. And both of these experiences means that if we have tools that can improve these outcomes, right, we should be considering them, we should be exploring them. And I think that's really the cusp of the argument here for when and why to encourage the usage and exploration of the Metaverse, is because we need better employee experiences, and we need to use employee experiences that are more natural, that create more connection and other things like that. And, the Metaverse type capabilities that we'll talk about today can do that. At the same time, I wanted to take a step back and really talk about three mega trends and why it's so important. The first is that I would argue that the Metaverse isn't really a new concept. It's just an evolution, not really a revolution either. It's just an evolution of experiences. I purposely took a really old picture on the left of old web conferencing solution, and you can see, even back in the day, we had web conferencing solutions. They were just very inaccessible. They were expensive. They were difficult. Not a lot of people could consume them, right? Because people didn't have the hardware, right, that would allow them to engage with it. Similarly, they didn't work on mobile, right? Mobile wasn't even really a form factor back in that day. And then on the left and the bottom left, you see learning. So this is actually a shared learning experience. However, it was before the internet, right? So, shared learning environments, that quote unquote are immersive. Same thing with gaming, where you're virtualizing worlds and then you're experiencing those worlds. These are all things that we've had. The challenge has been really the cost, how difficult it is to access, and then the blending of learning, work, and in some ways the fun and immersive aspect. And so I think that's where obviously we've seen a lot of change in the last few years. Now, from a organizational standpoint, there are users that are coming into organization who are familiar with VR. They're familiar with some of these experiences. And even if they're not, they're at least aware of them. They have a friend or a family member or somebody else who has one of these, headsets or things like that, and they've seen it, they've interacted with it. And that's a big deal because way back in the day, not everyone had a smartphone, right? But we had access to, or we knew someone who might have a nice BlackBerry or whatever. And so we got used to this idea of what a phone could be. And as it became more understood and the prices went down and things like that, it became more accessible. So it's not surprising to see that a lot of Gen Z and millennials do envision that some of their work could be done in the metaverse, or that the metaverse might impact their work in the next 2 years. And so that means that this is really something that we do need to look at, because it's a large percentage of people that do see this value. And we also need to be aware that there's a large category of people that are going to struggle with that transition. At the same time, there's no question the digital hub of today's enterprise is Microsoft Teams. So all my examples today will be Microsoft centric. This is, of course, the Microsoft Metaverse from a focus perspective. And at the end of the day, if the Metaverse can come to Teams in an intelligent way, that means it's a great entry point that's accessible. People are familiar with it. They're already using these tools. And so that has a huge impact. We'll talk about that. And then lastly, it's not surprising. There's lots of various stats around this, but remote work, the mode of work of hybrid work and remote work, leads to challenges around relationships, around connectivity, leads to a much more transactional nature of our work. And so these are things that could be offset by lots of employee experience investments, but in particular by things like the metaverse. So we'll talk about those as well today. For reference, the way that we see the metaverse is we see it as three sort of metaverses, three categories of metaverses that you would want to invest in. So there's the consumer metaverse, and for some people on this call, your company might be active in the consumer metaverse. It might be a way to generate more revenue, to be relevant to different audiences and things like that. There's the enterprise metaverse, what we'll talk about mainly today, which is sort of a combination of Mesh and HoloLens and a variety of other experiences like AltspaceVR, which we'll talk about, which is again kind of a bridge between the consumer metaverse and the enterprise metaverse. And then of course there's the industrial metaverse. And the industrial metaverse, I'll come back to this, but it's where the biggest ROI is, right? There's no question, if you could pick one to invest in, from a pure dollars perspective, the industrial metaverse has huge potential in most organizations. So today we're going to mainly focus on the enterprise metaverse, and then we'll just really lightly touch on the industrial metaverse at the end. So let's talk about what is a employee experience. And I'm going to use Jacob Morgan's, I think, a very excellent analogy here, where he describes it as three environments that reinforce one another, right? A cultural environment, a physical environment, and a technological environment. And these things lead to, what we consider the employee experience today. So let's talk about the cultural environment and how that is affected by the metaverse and these kinds of innovations and changes. Let's start with the thing that everyone mentions. Hey, what if we could have a sense of togetherness when working alone? And the beauty of this is you can, of course, achieve this with the metaverse, but you can even achieve it with some aspects of it as well. So we'll come back to it, but I think the avatar experience is one that you shouldn't dismiss. It has a huge potential within an organization. So I really want to focus more on that avatar concept, and then we'll expand later into traditional metaverse. So having presence has not always been equitable. Think of it like this, right? Without getting into politics or economic challenges, at the end of the day, if you had access to going to the head office and you could go to that meeting and be present in that meeting, that was an advantage you had. And that privilege might come with other things, like it might be a shorter commute. It might have, the ability for you to be more alert, not have to work so many hours to make up for the time that you're losing, et cetera. And so it's fair to state that the physical world is not equal. It's not equitable. People who can afford housing near most of these headquarters and offices are people that, already have a lot of means. And so I don't want to get into the nature of it, but it is fair to say that digital domains, whether they're VR and metaverse-like, or whether they're just using digital tools for remote work, they generally are more equitable, assuming, we think of the cost of rationalization of internet and good effective internet versus, the cost that I've described for equity of a house and things like that, which are much more expensive. So I think that that's a good thing. And these technologies that continue to improve the sense of presence we have in a room is something that we really want to look at. Now, I don't think that that's limited to the metaverse. Having really effective Teams meetings room systems and things like that, where your face is visible on the screen in the room, so that you have a presence that's always there. Those are things that also are really important. But there's no question, if I have like a HoloLens and I have holoportation and I can physically see an avatar of you in the room, it is a much different experience, and that's kind of like the poster child in the future that we're looking towards for striving it. Another one is that, without getting into, again, the details, avatars and systems like this enable us to still have not just a presence, but to have a way to express ourselves and to have a personalized expression. And that allows us potentially, for those who are not lucky like me, who have a green screen, who have lighting in my eyes right now, burning my retinas, that if we don't have those types of things, we can still look good and we can still have the experience we want. And I don't think this should be underestimated, because a lot of people in enterprise organizations, without getting into the weeds of it, you actually interpret a lot of signals when you look at somebody's camera, right? So if they have a messy background, if I've had my baby all up all night and my eyes are like super baggy and things like that, it's unfortunate, but we have a lot of these biases built into ours. And so there are biases in ways that people interpret that. And so again, things that remove those biases, they tend to create a more inclusive environment, and that's better. I won't get into all the lag stuff. There's lots of reasons why there's no lags in the metaverse. In most metaverses in general today, I think it's a good thing. I'll get into more detail there. Like if you're sitting versus standing, there's no difference in terms of, referenceability. And then functionally, it makes a lot of sense, since, most of us, if we're lucky enough to have an immersive experience, we have wands, or we have motions, hand motion devices and things like that, but we don't often have things that are full body suits and leg things and things of that nature. And then I think, there's an interesting question on, representation. I used the body size here because it was a little bit safer than talking about skin tone and things like that. But in general, whether the avatar really represents ourselves is a big question. Is it going to be enough detail, enough variation, enough models that it is inclusive by design? And I think, Microsoft's in a good position, both with Altspace and their own investments, that they can probably achieve this. But it is a question that we still don't know the answer to until this is scaled to a different degree than we have today. And then immersive technology can also be costly. So I think the most important thing today when we talk about the metaverse is that flat screen experience, because most people are going to experience the metaverse, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, through the flat screen. And so I think we want to be inclusive. We want to make sure that we're thinking about this strategy and experience from a flat screen first perspective until, again, the costs change. Just like the mobile phones, everyone has a smartphone, mobile phone. It's pretty safe to assume a mobile experience can be effective and a priority investment. I don't think that's as true if you go 10 years ago, right? So same sort of idea. These technologies will become more ubiquitous in our homes and things like that, and so it won't be as much of a challenge. But today, flat screen experience is really important. And then again, I can't stress enough, one of the things that offsets a lot of those risks that I mentioned is the more the avatar represents our expressions, our facial movements, the more it keeps consistent with that. There's audio cues as an example in the early code right now that detects like, hey, I'm speaking, and so the avatar's mouth opens and closes and things like that with it. There's hand movements and gestures. Those are really good starting points, from a reference perspective. But once you have those facial movements, that might help a lot more, right? Especially if we can control like the degree of those facial movements and things like that, so that the avatar is not like really excited all of a sudden randomly when someone's sharing something that's very tragic or difficult to share. And so we have to be aware that these technologies can lead to confusion, just like a message could versus a video call. So yeah, that's the high level from culture. The way to think about it is this, right? Most of us in our organizations have already had some of these discussions. If you haven't, these should be discussions that HR or cultural leads are leading. Do we control backgrounds in Teams video? It's a big question, right? Because yes, we want to have a blur background. I mentioned earlier why that's really helpful for people who don't have, access to like a home work environment that's as conducive as maybe others do, right? From a look and feel perspective and other functions, plus it protects privacy. So, we should allow for background blurring. We should allow for stylized backgrounds. The question is do we control them? In most organizations today that I work with, they do, right? They provide a bunch of different backgrounds that are branded or that are designed to allow for expression, but still, stay within, the domain of the organization. So that's a really good example, because when backgrounds first were released, they didn't have that capability, right? And so we had to have this question of like, oh, we're not ready to turn on backgrounds yet until we can control it, was essentially the answer most organizations took. Same sort of thing right now. A lot of people don't realize this, especially that I talk to in HR. You can have a green screen and filters, and I'm using something called OBS right now to display my video. I have complete control. I can use a filter that makes me look like a cat if I want to, right? I can do anything like that. The question is that allowed within our organizational context? And with mobile devices having the same kind of capabilities, there's a discussion there. And so I think that that's closer to where we start to transition towards avatar discussions, because it's what level of control, what level of expression do we allow, and which ones are risky areas that we would at least encourage, whether it's just policy based or whether it's actually enforced to control. And I think once you start to get through those types of discussions, talking about avatars becomes a much easier discussion point. They have a lot of value. I'll come back to that. And we do want to embrace them. The question is like, what's the right way for us as an organization to approach that? And then I think once you've had the avatar discussion, VR at work more broadly is a much easier discussion, because now we're okay with representations of ourselves that are 3D and so on and so forth. And we've talked about those experiences. Now talking about the worlds around, like how do we build worlds around ourselves, meeting room experiences, whatever, those types of things, just like the team's backgrounds, there's potentially a discussion there of like, how does that get approved and managed and so on and so forth. So that's the really high level of culture. Let's talk about the physical environment, which is also really important. In the physical environment, historically, from an employee experience perspective, has been this place that has diminished in its import, with the post-pandemic era, right? Because as work modes have increased in volume, there's been a lot more people who work within the context of hybrid or remote. The physical environment doesn't have the same impact as it used to. So it's true to say, if I come into your environment the first time I'm doing an interview, or I come into that environment, when I'm being onboarded, and it's a beautiful lobby and it's a great experience, like that we know statistically that motivates people to work there, to choose you as an employer, to do a bunch of things like that. And so that is, the physical environment historically has been quite important for recruitment, for onboarding, and a number of other things. We can use that with a virtual environment today and still at least create some similar experiences. Now, of course, I could just take pictures of the environment and have like this really nice brochure-like experience, but it's a really great thing now that it's so cheap and easy to build these virtual tours, right? Using just a smartphone nowadays, you can do it quite easily, or you can use specialized camera systems, or if it's a really large environment, drones and things like that. But this allows, because all those things are way cheaper and more accessible now, it allows us to create virtual tours much more easily. And those virtual tour experiences, because they're easier to create, could become more prominent or common. And so that's an easy way to represent the physical world, our workplaces within these tools. The second one is that labs, design environments, other things like that are also physical oriented environments for work. Those can also be represented, I think, quite well. And so some of the HoloLens 2 projects we've had have kind of fit this vein very well. Taking a large pharmaceutical, they have these lab setups, and you have to make sure that everything's in the proper spot and it's organized in a certain way. There's sort of QA that you do there. And so when you set that lab environment up, it's really nice to have this AR overlay saying this is where everything should be set up in the lab. Or conversely, here's a VR experience that this is what the lab should be set up as, and then you can kind of prep yourself or prime it. And again, it doesn't always have to be like the lab technicians that are setting all this up. There could be other people that are supporting them and things like that, and it speeds and accelerates the work that's involved. And the design was similar too. We have these construction engineering firms. And historically, they would have for building homes, they'd have these like sliding floors, really interesting engineering experiences that make it easier to perceive what a space might look like, how it might be laid out, how it might be structured. And that's very expensive, right, to build these physical environments. So what if we could create virtual environments that are similar or, of similar scale and capability, and then you could create that same sort of experience, or make it easier from site managers and other people like that to understand, the risks of the environment, or for architects, remotely to be able to, who are, highly skilled and difficult to sometimes get on site to be able to give feedback and things like that. So there's a lot there that we can do in the physical environment. And then of course, testing, you could take the picture below and say, well, if we just had a bunch of pictures and we just had the same questions, right? And we just kind of prompted people with a time window, they could give the same responses. And I would agree with that. I don't think VR necessarily is new. It's just a different way to immerse yourself in that testing environment. And we know that statistically that leads to greater retention and a variety of other experience benefits. So again, VR for testing and vetting and things like that for skilling, it tends to work really well. And I wouldn't underestimate, I'll come back to this, but I wouldn't underestimate its impact in making your organization seem digitally savvy and capable, and creating the right first impression, especially of digital excellence within your organization. And so that can really change the way people perceive something like a construction organization, right? And things like that historically have struggled with new applicants and things like that. But, at an expo, when you have a VR headset or when you have, AR or things like that, and you show like how you use these tools in the field in your construction work, that really sends a different signal than, maybe your competitors in that work expo and things of that nature. So yeah, physical environment does matter. It's certainly less important from a employee experience perspective than it has been in the past. Culture and technological environments are becoming more and more dominant because of the shift away from physical environments towards remote work and hybrid work. But this is another way to bring that physical environment that you've often invested a lot of time and energy and has value, to bring that into that digital world, right? To make it a little bit more friendly and effective for remote or hybrid employees. And then the last category for employee experience is technological. And this is one where I think we just need a little bit of a deeper dive. So we'll probably spend the last 20 minutes really digging into this particular category. So let's talk about those categories of, with the way we break it down for technological environments is or digital, if you prefer that, digital employee experience, is there's these employee communication experiences, there's employee collaboration experiences, and then there's sort of a relatively new category of employee management experiences. And so today, when we talk about the metaverse is affecting all three of these categories in very interesting ways. And so again, I can't go into great detail, but I can at least give you some summaries of this. The first thing to note is that the metaverse is not alone, right, in terms of changing the way employee communication is experienced today. A lot of organizations are using things like Viva Engage, and especially now that it's been publicly released, and that's improving, how people connect, right, outside of those transactional interactions. Great for remote work and things like that. A lot of people might be using things like the Viva experiences for Viva Learning, for sort of socialized learning and things of that nature. So again, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to how do we communicate better, and how does that communication experience get enriched by Microsoft innovation. But in particular, since we're talking about the metaverse, I want to focus on SharePoint and Teams and specific subsets of capabilities within those. So the first one, and I think one that's been around for a long time, I hope people are aware of it, is SharePoint Spaces. And we've been lucky enough to do multiple projects with customers in SharePoint Spaces. So I thought I would take a step back and first explain what it is, because I think a lot of people still don't really understand, why did Microsoft invest in this thing? Why does it matter? So really quickly, the gist of it is, if you think of SharePoint is a content services platform, and it provides the content services across the rest of these Microsoft 365 experiences. There's a form of content that has exploded in growth in the last, 5 to 10 years, and that is 3D content, right? So 3D objects, 3D imagery, 3D, immersive experiences, all of those things, those representations, those are things that have increased in volume and velocity and variety over the last 2 years. And because we've seen that increase, we need to have an experience that supports that. And so in this way, it's pretty understandable that Microsoft has these sort of library-like experiences, if you're familiar with SharePoint terms, these ways to organize your 3D assets, and then, to be able to navigate them, to preview them, to do things like that. And that's really, honestly, the value of SharePoint Spaces in a nutshell, is it's if we have 3D interactions, we have 3D needs, that we have a tool that's basically free for us, built into a tool that we already use all the time, which is SharePoint, that empowers that experience. Now, the reality then is, how do people really use this? And I wanted to use very specific examples from the work that we've done in the past where it comes up commonly, which is this idea of, what if we can create a different way to do those virtual tours, to do some of those physical representations that I mentioned earlier, but at a really low cost. And I think that's really what SharePoint Spaces provides today, besides, again, like a way to organize 3D assets. If you think of the example here, what I'm using is a 360 video or a 360 image, and then I can annotate that image or video. You can see these are annotations on the right. Again, I have examples on the left there. And so this allows us to potentially put interaction points throughout this experience. Again, this is emphasized as as a 2D experience, right? It's a flat screen experience where I'm using my, desktop or an experience like that to explore this space, not dissimilar to how people would explore Metaverse capabilities in Microsoft Mesh for Teams or AltspaceVR. But again, it's a way to explore that, with very little, effort. It doesn't take much effort at all to create a SharePoint space, throw some annotations together, and have potentially not just a tour that has some click-throughs, but a tour that actually has, call outs, and, you can dive deeper for more details and so on and so forth. So I think in that way, SharePoint Spaces is something people underestimate. It has value. Going back to my earlier reference point, we should have lots of virtual tours. This is an easy way, if you don't want a more advanced tool, this is an easy way to get started on that journey. And so, in that way, SharePoint Spaces still has relevancy, even in a Microsoft Mesh future. Where this connects with Microsoft Mesh longer term, I think, is where we start to get into compliance journeys and things like that. Think about it like this. Right now, they already have the underpinnings to create a way to organize in libraries assets that are 3D. And so having a environment for immersive space, or having, objects like avatars, other concepts, in a way that allows for compliance journeys, I think is very feasible, because they've already explored a lot of that here within SharePoint Spaces. Now, again, I'm not saying that they're available today, but that is a positive trend in terms of previous investment from Microsoft. And so that brings us to our next big challenge, which is AltspaceVR. And I want to be clear that I think AltspaceVR is a really interesting experience. As someone who has, the benefit of having a VR headset, I have a Valve Index. I love AltspaceVR. It's a really enjoyable experience, and it really does, it's not identical to an in-person experience, but it really does create a real sense of connectivity, a sense of presence. Again, presence is really the key there within that room, that place that we're having these panel discussions and so on and so forth. So I think in this way, I think lots of organizations should experiment with AltspaceVR. Now, the risk here is AltspaceVR really is not an enterprise solution. I mean, you can use it in the enterprise with risks, but you have to understand those risks. And so at the end of the day, until this becomes part of Microsoft Teams Mesh and things like that, which you'll see coming in the future, this is something that you want to use with careful diligence, right? And it creates some interesting questions. The speaker just before this, if you haven't seen their session, I would really encourage in the recordings to go look back at it. It brings up questions around, who owns these virtual environments? Who owns the content, right? So if you have, a party at an event in the organization, and you're just organizing it because you're a great steward and you want to champion these experiences, is that an official organizational thing? Is that your thing? There's lots of broad questions about that. So I think this is one of those ones that, at a minimum, executives, HR, IT, corporate comms, other people need to try it, to experience it, to see the value of it, and then either wait and use that learning that they gained from this within Teams Mesh, or at this point in time, at least experiment with very light things that are very non-confidential, low risk kind of events and activities that you could share there. And that brings us to Microsoft Mesh, which is really just an evolution on some of those communication patterns that we mentioned earlier. This idea of being able to have these spaces that we can organize, annotate, create, those are things that potentially help with communication. And, I think it's a bit early to say exactly how this is going to work. The builds have been a little bit different each time internally. So I think at the end of the day, this is going to be a journey over the next few years. And I would say that the biggest value of this long term is really represented well in this picture. And what you want to think about here is, yes, of course, we can have like those auditorium-like experiences in AltspaceVR within, Microsoft Teams context. Absolutely, this is going to be a future state. But where it becomes really interesting is when you actually have events that I think are very common for employee communication. So like having two executives speak. Now, normally what you'd do is you'd have a setup, a stage kind of environment. You'd have cameras, you'd have lighting, and you'd have those two executives talking to one another. But that can be really challenging because, one, not everyone is an executive that can, benefit or should be, invested in for this very staged environment. It's quite expensive, not just for that, but for the streaming experience, for all sorts of different elements. It can be very complex. And so those are costly events, which means it's not that I think that they're not better. I think they are probably better than what we're talking about here. The downside of them is that, one, other people can't kind of immerse themselves in that event. Number two, it's inaccessible to a lot of mid-managers or even like executives that are just not at that top tier in terms of, the priority of their messaging. And so I think it's really unfortunate because there's lots of people who have a voice and they want to share that voice in more effective ways than just video snippets and things like that, or, flat video calls and things of that nature. And this enables potentially that sense, especially if, and we'll come back to this, if avatars really take off as a core concept within your organization for comfort. Because those executives, again, if they don't have great lighting systems, or peers or people who want to have panel discussions can do so with a level of comfort, not to mention, transcription and you can see translation and other types of services that are built into Microsoft Teams today, that those things will continue to evolve within this mesh experience. And so that can also make it more inclusive. It can make it a lot more personalizable and more expressive, arguably longer term at a much lower cost than potentially we could do in a physical environment. Again, creating a virtual space that looks great and that matches like the theme and the agenda of what you're trying to communicate is much easier in these types of environments than it is in the physical world. And that means that these can be used more often to create a full communication experience, not just one where it's a person's voice, but one where you're really seeing a lot of different things come together to deliver a message. So that's the excitement for it. The overall net of communications for employee experience is you need to experiment with things like AltspaceVR today. You absolutely should be using SharePoint Spaces in lightweight ways or something better in the marketplace that's integrated with SharePoint. Those are the two things that I would encourage you today. And as soon as Microsoft Mesh is available for Microsoft Teams for your organization, I would really encourage you to experiment with it in the same ways that I've described, knowing that until the compliance capabilities and other things come, it probably will take a while before you can have those encrypted discussions, very real discussions, panels, things like that about product direction and things like that internally that people would get a lot of value from. And again, I can't express enough how helpful the avatar system and the virtual world can be at communicating that more effectively. Another thing, just as a quick note of why communication-wise this is so powerful and what's changing, and one of the biggest changes is this idea that we can actually use the cloud infrastructure, cloud technology, to empower a better experience without necessarily that crazy hardware. And this example that I show on the right of this room scale picture, taken with drones with high definition cameras, taking a picture of a bridge and then having people have this room scale discussion around it using, in this example, using HoloLens and talking about, the different aspects, what we need to do from an engineering perspective. That is happening today. That goes back to the industrial discussion. But those experiences, because they're so high definition, are empowered because we use the power of the cloud to do that processing. And so if we go back to examples like this and more, we could potentially create a very different level of fidelity, right? As we look forward many years, we can get a different level of fidelity, and that level of fidelity changes how and where we can communicate. And so there's a video specifically I took this from. I really encourage you. I think it's in the slide deck, but encourage you to go take a look at how these tools and these systems work. It can be really, really powerful. So I think Microsoft's specific strategy on using the cloud to make it so that the hardware on your headset or the device itself isn't as important, or even that 2D flat screen plane, right, to have a really high fidelity experience there, that's achievable, and costs are only going to go down there. I think that's something that's really compelling of why this has so much potential in the future. So that's the employee communication experience. Explore AltspaceVR, SharePoint Spaces, do both of those today, and then when Microsoft Mesh becomes available, you'll be in a better position to really transition towards that and embrace it in the right ways. Let's talk about employee collaboration experiences. And again, there's lots of other technologies at play here, but specifically SharePoint and Teams dominates. And I wanted to talk about this avatar concept in deeper detail. The avatar is a really, really important concept because I think everyone in this call and every organization is going to use avatars, right? And avatars is a representation, right, of a 3D you. It's an immersive view. Now, yes, it's not like the whole world around you. It needs to be that immersive, but it's a really, really effective starting point. And it has value. If you're looking at the camera like this, you're smiling, you're looking into this bright light, right? It's a very taxing experience to do this. And when I'm in a meeting after meeting, with customers and other stakeholders, I know how exhausting this can be all day because I do it all day long. And so having the ability, especially for internal meetings where I'm just, like I said, I woke up, the baby didn't sleep well, I'm really exhausted, being able to turn off my camera, but still have a presence, right? That's a really powerful capability. And it's not, I've heard people say, well, oh, if I just have a really high def picture, right, I can have the same experience. It's not the same, because the high def picture doesn't have its mouth move when you move. It doesn't move its hands. I'm a very, obviously I gesticulate a lot. It doesn't do those things. It doesn't have, like, longer term, this idea of mimicking your facial movements, like wow, and whatever, the smile, etc. So I think those are things that you shouldn't underestimate. The experiences we've had in testing this has been amazing. And I fully embrace this as someone who's going to use it all the time, so that I don't always have to have my camera on, unless, I think it's really important to have that real sense of I'm focused, my expression, etc. So again, something that I think is really going to offset some of the fatigue we've been experiencing. It gives people more flexibility, more ways to express themselves, and it's something that will lead to a lot more engaging calls versus just having those initials or that non-moving picture, which is 90% of the calls that I seem to have with people today. And then this becomes a little bit more interesting. Once you get used to the idea of the avatars being really valuable, it becomes easier to then say, okay, well, what if we had, immersive spaces to have a meeting? And this is where I think it really depends. I think at the end of the day, these spaces will be great if you have a headset. Number one, 100%, this is going to be a great experience for meetings. Number two, if you look at it and you're working on something that benefits from a 3D discussion, even if you don't have a headset. And so, this idea of inking, right, annotation with 3D is something that is very natural feeling, and it can be really powerful when we're talking about concepts that are 3D. I think if you have a 2D plane, if we're just talking about like whiteboarding, I'm a little bit hesitant to say that this is going to be better. I really think you should just use the great tools for whiteboarding and other tools that are built into Teams today. That typically is a better experience, especially if there's a large category of people that are going to be in that 2D or flat screen plane. So again, great if you have technology like VR headsets, and those are becoming more common, or if you as an organization want to buy VR headsets, for a subset of staff, people that are super collaborators, leaders, people are in a lot of those meetings where they can have these more natural experiences, right, from, with other people that have headsets. I think that's really the target audience initially. And there's some interesting ideas besides just creating, standard meetings and having them in a 3D way. There's also the idea of drop-in spaces, which is an interesting one, where you could have these sort of spaces. And unlike, a team room where we have this team discussion, you can just join in. It has a sense of presence, which is really important for creating that natural, spontaneous interaction. Now, the downside of all of this is I actually think people are underestimating the value of breakouts in Teams today. So, and of course, Viva, Engage, and Yammer communities and things like that. So I think one of the biggest things to think about is not necessarily to invest now in Microsoft Mesh and thinking of what meetings should we do that are, three-dimensional, should be more immersive. I think that's too early. Instead, focus on avatars. And then I think your focus should be on things like, okay, how do we make meetings more effective at connecting with others? And the breakout rooms are a really powerful way of doing this, because when you have 4, 5 people in a room, right, in a meeting, people actually do engage. They talk with one another. They open up more because a small number of audience allows for that interaction. When you have 20 people, 15 people, 10 people even, it's almost impossible for people to really have a sense of presence in that room because there's too many virtual people in that space. And so breakouts is a really great way to start experiencing and improving these types of interactions. The next time you have an all hands or something else, what if you did randomized breakouts with people where there's 4 or 5 and you had like pre-designed questions, like ask these questions or talk about these subject matters together. And then, at the end of that, an agent, a leader within your group could share, what you guys talked about, what you learned, et cetera. Like, these are really powerful things that create a real sense of connection, spontaneous connection and natural connection, but could be done in a way that, is using capabilities that are available to you today that are also, designed a little bit more thoroughly for some of these experiences. Now, again, all of these things have even more value when you have immersive environments in the future. So these are just ways to get started, I think, on these today. And then I will highlight, just from a personal perspective, I think the HoloLens experience, AR, I fundamentally love it more than VR. Now, I'm a person who has spends lots of time in VR. I enjoy it. I enjoy chat in VR. I enjoy gaming in VR and a bunch of other things. I can say that the AR experience feels better for that presence. And I think that's really the gut problem of a lot of organizations today. You have hybrid meetings, and we've all felt it since the pandemic. We've been mostly digital, and then we go to hybrid now. And we're like, oh, I don't have a presence in that room. And having a visual presence in a room that's both physical and virtual, I think is why AR is so powerful in this context. So I have seen a lot of people very interested in mesh and things like that, but don't underestimate the value of AR in this experience, assuming AR continues to get cheaper and more, the field of view and a bunch of other things continue to improve, because those are going to really make a difference as well. So yeah, I really like the holoprotation patterns that we've been using ourselves internally, because we're lucky enough to have HoloLenses, and it's a really good experience. And if you can afford it, or like I said, for key stakeholders, you can start to invest in these things. I think you're kind of starting the discussions on what does this mean, what are the considerations, how do we protect people. I think there's some really good discussions that would come out of this experimentation. Now, lastly, I'm just going to comment, of course, when we talk about these collaboration experiences, not everyone is equal. And I think that's fair. In an enterprise environment, there are people that are super collaborators. There are people that deliver more value in collaboration. And I think really what I'd be looking at is those who are working on physical, 3D, type content, right? Discussions and subject matter and meetings and things like that around that. They're the ones where, the initial investments in headsets and some of these experiences should be from an organizational perspective, because they're just going to benefit more from it in the short term, until, again, this becomes a very common experience and everyone just has access to it. And then it becomes, now there's no barrier or cost entry, so it becomes something that we apply to more audiences within the organization. So on the bottom there is that HoloLens, holoprotation-like experience. I think those types of things are things that we need to invest in now to experiment with. And then some of the other things I've already mentioned, better use of teams, breakouts, concepts like that really engage and maximize the value of teams, so you're prepared for that future state. Let's talk about management experiences. I'll go through this quickly, because I know I'm at the end of the call, and I think also, to be honest, a lot of these are things we're still learning within the VR space. But I do think there's some really interesting patterns here. There's this really great white paper by Microsoft around education immersion experiences. And I know that this is more for the education sector, but it's really, really good in that it summarizes a lot of the values of immersive technology on education in a way that's really easy to understand. So I've taken some excerpts from that and put it into the slide for you. Again, my slides are available afterwards or in this recording. But please take a look at this material, because, again, statistically, we know that these immersive experiences lead to much better learning outcomes. And I used that example earlier, construction industry or somebody like that, who often is not seen as digitally savvy or is an area that struggles with new candidates. Using AR and VR and these types of things within those onboarding or those initial first impression experiences is a really powerful way to send a signal that you're the organization people want to work with. And digital is a priority. Digital experience is a huge priority for candidates that are applying to your organization. So we need to make sure that that's supported. Another example, and of course, digital skilling is a big gap as well. Another example here is the industrial metaverse. And I've already mentioned earlier, I have no doubt the ROI is highest here. Right? If we're picking money. Now, obviously, consumer, you might get lucky and you might be really successful there. I don't want to talk about that today because I don't have the time for it. But I think the industrial metaverse, they're clean opportunities. You have control of the data. We have IoT often implemented throughout these experiences, like in facilities and on factory floors, or in things like that. We're already doing preventative maintenance, I hope, with these tools. And so now all of a sudden we can do digital twins, and we can do simulations, and we can do more using that data we already have, and just some camera work and things like that to create a better experience. And it's so accessible now. Like, the digital twins capability is so easy to work with compared to what we had to do in the past. I think this is a real game changer. And there's even things like Dynamics 365 connected spaces for retail, as an example, that make this also accessible. So these things aren't future state. They're happening now for sure in the industrial space. So things like display effectiveness and being able to use camera systems where the camera system is training and looking at it from an AI perspective. Oh, okay, this display was more effective than that one. This layout worked better. Like, those are things you can do today really easily with these tools. And I think that the fact that these types of things are so easy to do nowadays and so cost effective is really what's driving a lot of the success within the metaverse today. And most of the investment I see, at scale, right, from customers is in this space, not the enterprise, because the enterprise just isn't ready, right? Like we mentioned. have avatars, we need Teams Mesh. There's other things that need to come to play. So, I didn't talk about this, but all of these actually impact the employee experience as well, right? These tools provide us ways to work smarter, to do more with less. All those things improve the employee experience. So I hope that's been helpful for you. I've got some slides here with materials for follow-up. We talk a lot about employee experience, so I tried to include a bunch of employee experience papers. And in addition to those, there's one particular book, apologies for not having it on here, which is m365ideas.com, which has a bunch of employee experience ideas on how to take teams and these other things further and improve the employee experience. There's feedback. I really welcome feedback. This is the first time publicly I think I've done this kind of session. I've done it obviously with a lot of customers, but it'd be really great to find, is there things I didn't mention that you'd really want to see? And of course, if you haven't asked a question yet, because you've been just trying to absorb, feel free to ask that now, and I'll try and answer them in the sidebar as we transition to the next speaker in the next little bit. So thank you everyone for your time, and I hope this has been helpful.
Thank you, Richard.
Any questions, Matty?
My chat actually froze and my messages actually came like 15 minutes kind of afterwards, but everyone has a chance to open their mic and a camera and ask questions, because really interesting session, and I think the topic for today have been that when we will have the Microsoft Mesh for Teams.
Yes, I don't think I'm allowed to talk about that today, unfortunately, but that's a good one. There's experiences that are represented in the mesh that you can explore today. Avatars are available in AltspaceVR. It has a two-dimensional or flat screen experience. You don't have to have a headset, right, to experience this. I think that those are good ways to experiment with it. And then, when it becomes available for your environment, you're at least you have an understanding, right, of how some of these experiences might work. I would say you do that. Just you want to wait for security, compliance, governance reasons for that to be in an encrypted environment that's in Teams, and that's going to take a bit more time for Microsoft. Yeah, it's a great question on the timing. It's not as far away as you probably think, though. I'll put it that way, since I can't remember if Microsoft's publicly stated anything.
This summer, but is the summer over yet? So.
Avatars will be first, right? So you'll get a subset of experiences, and avatars won't be. I can say this: they won't be tracking like your facial movements to the degree that I was talking about. It'll just be verbal cues, and not every verbal cue, because obviously you don't want everything to be like reacting. So there'll be verbal cues. They'll probably be English only. So there's a bunch of things, probably US first, et cetera, and specific markets first. Some of these things are public. I think they've announced like the direction that they're intending to roll these things out. But Mesh itself is going to have like a multi-phase strategy. So even then, like if you're across the world, you have different languages, it may take you a while before you can really fully utilize this. And that's the key, right, is we shouldn't wait till then for the policy, the cultural discussions, those types of things. We need to have those now so that we're ready, and then we can support the landing of this technology once it's starting to circle our organization, when people are starting to experiment with it, right? We're like, the demand is going to keep increasing, not decrease here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do you see the chat yet? No?
I still unfortunately don't. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, there was some good comments. Huge thanks and very good presentation. So good content to use to convince our organization to move forward. So positive feedback.
Awesome.
But still, there's time for some questions if anyone just wants to open their mic. Because if you're typing into the chat, it might appear to me like 50 minutes later. So my chat is also jammed. I can see the chat, but chat probably not in real time. So, but
yeah,
cool stuff. Yeah. And a lot of resources, actually.
Yeah, and don't hesitate, everyone who's listening to this on the recording or in the call. Again, reach out on LinkedIn or things like that. Sometimes having support is a big deal. So, instead of you championing and trying to convince everyone in your organization, like, hey, the metaverse is really exciting, there's some things to think about here. Just like it doesn't need to be us, but like have somebody externally who's an expert who works with other customers come in and say, hey, this is why, this is a thing you need to start tackling now. Here's like the costs, right? I didn't even get into it. There's like real costs. Right now, there are real legal cases in market for organizations that haven't started to think about this and address this, right? So it's not like we're talking about something that, in 2 years from from now or something, we're going to have to tackle the metaverse. You have to tackle it now from an organizational perspective, and then you need to build on that foundation you've established, as new experiences become available. And I think avatars really opens up a lot of discussions in organizations as the sort of tip of the spear of the metaverse. And I think it's the right tip of the spear. I think it's very low risk for most organizations to have planned on that. So if every organization at least has their avatar strategy, they're all set for that, I would feel a little bit less anxious. But the number of organizations I speak to and leaders who have never heard of any of this is really, really high. And so, events like this, thank you, Metaverse One, right? Like we need to get the message out there more and help people understand that some of these technology capabilities are here now and can have a direct impact, a concrete impact today, virtual tours, things like that. And then some, they're coming very soon, right? And so, and there's already a demand, right? Like, let's be clear, there are people absolutely who want this ability to express themselves, to have a presence, to be able to connect, right, in a way that is more meaningful. And experiencing it is the best way to learn that. Like when the first time you ever do VR chat, it's awkward, right? But like you're like, oh, this is really different. It does feel like I'm in a room with somebody. The brain chemistry starts to work the same way. It's quite interesting. Question from Peter, or is Peter speaking next? No worries. Yeah.
No, we're actually closing this room and moving to the room 1 for the ending keynotes from Microsoft. But thank you, Richard. Actually, 1+ for mentioning SharePoint Space a second time in a session. So I wrote a blog about SharePoint Spaces like 3 years ago when they were launched, and now I really need to revisit SharePoint Spaces.
Yeah, there hasn't been a ton of evolution there. Obviously, Microsoft's investments is in some of these other categories, but fundamentally, there's a lot of learnings there from Microsoft. So be sure to watch for how these things start to coalesce in the coming years. But yeah, awesome. Again, thank you for having me. Go enjoy the keynote, guys. It'll be a great one. Bye for now.
Thank you.